July 28, 1945. Kagoshima Bay, Japan. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the airfield as Lieutenant Masahisa Uemura performed the ceremonial rituals before his final mission. The cherry blossoms had long since fallen, but their memory lingered as he tied the white hachimaki headband bearing the rising sun. At 23, he was among the oldest remaining pilots of the 721st Shinpu Special Attack Squadron. He believed, as they all did, that his sacrifice would turn the tide of war, forcing the Americans to abandon their Pacific campaign before they could reach the sacred homeland. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Lieutenant Uemura could not know as he climbed into his modified Mitsubishi A6M0 that morning was that across the vast Pacific, a weapon beyond imagination was already being prepared, one that would transform not just this war, but all conceptions of warfare thereafter. His unwavering faith in victory through sacrifice would soon collide with the devastating reality of industrial and scientific supremacy. The Kamikaze program, officially designated Tokubetsu Kogekitai, Special Attack Unit, had been formalized in October 1944 as Japan faced increasingly desperate circumstances. Admiral Takejiro Onishi had proposed the strategy after the disastrous Battle of Leyte Gulf, where Japan lost 3 aircraft carriers and most of its remaining naval aviation strength. If we are to die anyway, let us die gloriously, Onishi had proclaimed to a room of solemn officers at Mabalacat Airfield in the Philippines. Captain Taro Miyazaki, operations officer for the 721st Squadron, maintained meticulous records of each mission. His leather-bound logbook, later recovered by American forces, documented 187 sorties from his unit alone. Our pilots achieve a 28% hit rate against American vessels, he wrote on June 12, 1945. Each successful strike removes approximately 700 Americans from the war. At this rate, we require only 1,200 more successful missions to break their resolve. The mathematical certainty with which Miyazaki calculated victory reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial capacity. By mid-1945, the United States was producing 50,000 aircraft annually, more than Japan had manufactured during the entire war. While Japanese factories struggled to produce 1,500 aircraft per month with increasingly scarce materials and under constant bombing, a single Boeing plant in Seattle could assemble a new B-29 Superfortress bomber every 7 hours. Across the Pacific, Major Thomas Farabee, bombardier of the B-29 Enola Gay, practiced with an unusually shaped bomb casing at Wendover Army Airfield in Utah. "This one's different," he told Colonel Paul Tibbets, the aircraft commander. "The ballistics are unlike anything I've dropped before." Neither man knew precisely what the device contained, only that it weighed 9,700 pounds and required a specialized release mechanism. Farabee had already logged 63 combat missions, dropping conventional bombs totaling over 300 tons. The single bomb he was now practicing with would deliver the equivalent explosive force of 15,000 tons of TNT. Lieutenant Uemura completed the final inspection of his Zero, modified for its one-way mission. The aircraft had been stripped of armor, radio equipment, and even the rear gun to accommodate a 550-pound bomb and extra fuel. The mechanics had sealed the cockpit with simple wooden pins rather than proper fasteners. There would be no need to service this aircraft again. The Americans send their pilots up in aircraft with self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating, and emergency radios, scoffed Technical Sergeant Hiroshi Takeda, the ground crew chief. They fear death. That is why they will lose. He patted the bomb attached to the Zero's belly. This is all the protection Lieutenant Uemura needs. What Takeda could not comprehend was that the B-29s bombing Japan nightly carried crews of 11 men each, flying missions that lasted up to 16 hours round trip. Each Superfortress cost $600,000 to produce, equivalent to 120 Zeros, and the United States had built nearly 4,000 of them. The Americans could afford to bring their airmen home because they had built a war machine of unprecedented scale. In a small wooden shrine near the airfield's edge Second Lieutenant Toshio Nakamura wrote his final letter home. At 19, he had received only 17 hours of flight training, barely enough to take off, navigate to a target, and dive. His instructors had not bothered teaching landing procedures. "Honorable Mother," he wrote, "I go joyfully to serve the Emperor and protect our sacred homeland. When the cherry blossoms bloom next spring, look for me among them. I will return to Japan on the winds." Nakamura sealed the letter with a single drop of blood from his finger and placed it in a small wooden box along with a lock of his hair. These would be delivered to his family after his glorious death. Nearly 4,000 kamikaze pilots would perish before the war's end, their average age just 20 years. On Tinian Island in the Marianas, 1,500 miles southeast of Japan, Colonel Tibbets reviewed weather forecasts for the coming week. 3 Japanese cities had been designated as potential targets: Hiroshima, Kokura, and Nagasaki. The mission required visual bombing conditions, unlike the regular incendiary raids, which could be conducted through cloud cover using radar. "We get one shot at this," Tibbets told his assembled crew on August 4, 1945. "There's no going back for a second pass." The crew of the Enola Gay represented a cross-section of American technical expertise. Navigator Theodore Dutch Van Kirk had studied engineering before the war. Radar operator Joe Staborik had been a radio technician in civilian life. Tail gunner Robert Caron had worked as an insurance salesman. Each man had been selected not just for his military skill, but for his educational background and psychological stability. Lieutenant Uemura's squadron represented a different kind of selection. Most had been university students, literature majors, engineers, and one former law student. They had been chosen for their ideological reliability and willingness to die. Their training focused on spiritual preparation rather than combat tactics or survival skills. Vice Admiral Mato Magaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet responsible for kamikaze operations in the home islands, noted in his diary on July 28, "The quality of pilots declines with each passing month. We now send boys to their deaths with barely enough training to take off. But their spirit remains strong. Perhaps spirit alone will be enough." Captain John Lewis, intelligence officer for the 509th Composite Group tasked with delivering the atomic bombs, had a different perspective. In a classified report dated July 25, 1945, he wrote, "Japanese reliance on spirit versus American industrial might represents the fundamental miscalculation of their war strategy. They continue to sacrifice their most educated young men in suicide attacks, while we preserve our human capital and multiply our material advantages." The report included production statistics that underscored this disparity. America had produced 296,400 aircraft during the war compared to Japan's 76,320. More tellingly, by 1945, Japan's production was falling precipitously due to material shortages and bombing, while American production continued to rise. The United States commissioned 151 aircraft carriers of all types during the war. Japan managed only 17. Lieutenant Hidehiko Watanabe, a kamikaze instructor who had survived 14 combat missions before being assigned to training duties, attempted to prepare his pilots psychologically. "When you see the enemy carrier, remember that your aircraft is a human bullet," he told them during their final briefing. "Aim for the elevator or between the island and the flight deck. That is where you will cause the most damage." What Watanabe did not tell them was that American carriers now deployed up to 80 fighters in combat air patrols, creating a nearly impenetrable defensive screen. Radar detected incoming aircraft at distances up to 100 miles, giving defenders ample time to intercept. Anti-aircraft guns had been improved and multiplied on all vessels. Of the 1,228 kamikaze attacks during Operation Kikusui in April-June 1945, only 57 had succeeded in hitting Allied vessels. Despite their willingness to die, most kamikaze pilots never reached their targets. As Lieutenant Uemura's squadron prepared for takeoff, Major Claude Etherly piloted a weather reconnaissance aircraft named Straight Flush toward Hiroshima. His mission was to verify that visibility conditions were suitable for the atomic bombing. Etherly had no knowledge of the weapon's nature, only that if he reported clear weather, a special bombing mission would follow. The date was now August 6, 1945. Lieutenant Uemura had been delayed by mechanical issues and fuel shortages, persistent problems in the resource-starved Japanese military. As he waited, a single B-29 approached Hiroshima at 31,000 feet, more than twice the maximum altitude his Zero could reach. At 8:15 a.m. local time, the Enola Gay released Little Boy over Hiroshima. 43 seconds later, the uranium-based weapon detonated 1,968 feet above the city with a blinding flash visible for miles. The explosive yield was later calculated at 15 kilotons, the equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and was now stationed at a naval base 115 miles from Hiroshima, recalled the moment. First, a blinding light, then a sound unlike any bombing I had experienced. Something had changed in the nature of warfare itself. When reports reached Tokyo, the military leadership initially refused to believe a single bomb could cause such devastation. Naval Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yanai dispatched Commander Hisamatsu Nakamura to investigate personally. Determine what type of bombs were used and in what quantity, his orders specified. The concept of a single atomic weapon remained beyond their comprehension. Lieutenant Uemura heard the news from returning reconnaissance pilots later that day. An entire city destroyed by one bomb? Impossible, he declared to his squadron mates. American propaganda to demoralize us. His scheduled mission against American naval forces was postponed as higher command assessed the situation. At the urging of physicist Yoshio Nishina, one of the few Japanese scientists who understood the theoretical possibility of an atomic weapon, military authorities dispatched radiation detection equipment to Hiroshima. On August 7th, readings confirmed the unthinkable. The Americans had harnessed atomic energy as a weapon. Even as this realization began to spread among Japan's leadership, preparations continued for conventional defense against invasion. On August 8th, Lieutenant Uemura received orders to proceed with his delayed mission the following morning. That same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, shattering any hope of Soviet mediation to end the war on favorable terms. As Uemura performed maintenance checks on his aircraft on August 9th, a second B-29 boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, approached the city of Kokura with the second atomic bomb, Fat Man. Finding Kokura obscured by smoke from a conventional bombing of a nearby city, Sweeney diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man detonated over Nagasaki with a yield of 21 kilotons. The plutonium-based implosion weapon was even more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. When news of the second bombing reached Lieutenant Uemura's airfield, the reaction was markedly different. Captain Miyazaki gathered his pilots. "We must consider the strategic implications," he said, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "The Americans can evidently produce these weapons in quantity." This assessment, while logical, was incorrect. The United States had exhausted its supply of combat-ready atomic bombs with the Nagasaki attack. However, the Japanese had no way of knowing this, and the demonstration of two different atomic weapon designs suggested a production capacity that did not yet exist. In Tokyo, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, the Big Six leadership group, remained deadlocked even after the second bombing. 3 members favored accepting the Potsdam Declaration with the single condition that the emperor's position be preserved. 3 others insisted on additional conditions: no occupation of the homeland, Japanese-led disarmament, and Japanese control over war crimes trials. Emperor Hirohito, traditionally removed from direct political decisions, requested an imperial conference on August 10th. After hearing both arguments, he broke the deadlock. "I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. Continuing the war can only result in the annihilation of the Japanese nation and the total extinction of human civilization." This announcement reached Lieutenant Uemura's squadron on August 11th through their commanding officer. "The Emperor has decided to accept the Allied terms," Captain Miyazaki informed them. "All offensive operations are suspended immediately." The pilots reacted with disbelief and anger. Second Lieutenant Nakamura drew his ceremonial sword. This is unacceptable. We must continue to fight. Several others voiced similar sentiments. Their entire identity had become entwined with the concept of sacrificial death. Captain Miyazaki removed his officer's cap and placed it carefully on his desk. "I share your feelings," he said quietly. "But the Emperor's word is absolute. We have sworn to obey him in all things." The psychological impact on the kamikaze pilots was profound. They had mentally prepared for death, written final letters, and divested themselves of earthly attachments. Now they faced the prospect of survival and defeat, something for which they had no preparation. Lieutenant Uemura locked himself in the squadron shrine for 3 hours. When he emerged, his face was composed but his eyes hollow. "We must now live with purpose," he told his comrades. "That will be harder than dying with purpose." On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's recorded surrender announcement was broadcast throughout Japan. For most Japanese citizens, it was the first time they had ever heard the emperor's voice. The carefully worded statement never used the word surrender, instead explaining that Japan must endure the unendurable and suffer the insufferable by accepting Allied terms. The broadcast reached Lieutenant Uemura's squadron as they sat in formal seiza position in their barracks. After it concluded, Captain Miyazaki stood and bowed deeply toward Tokyo. "The Emperor has spoken. We will obey." Not all military units accepted the surrender so readily. Major Kenji Hatanaka led an attempted coup in Tokyo, trying to prevent the broadcast from being aired. The rebellion was quickly suppressed. At other bases, officers committed ritual suicide rather than surrender. Vice Admiral Agaki, commander of the kamikaze forces, led a final unauthorized mission on August 15th, flying into the sea near Okinawa with 10 other aircraft in a last act of defiance. Lieutenant Uemura considered this path. He had already died in his mind. Physical death would merely confirm what he had spiritually accepted months earlier. But something in the Emperor's words about enduring the unendurable resonated with him. Perhaps surviving defeat honorably required more courage than a glorious death. When American occupation forces arrived at Kagoshima Airfield on September 3, 1945, they found Lieutenant Uemura and his squadron standing at attention in full uniform. Captain Miyazaki presented his sword to Lieutenant Colonel James Anderson of the U.S. Army Air Forces. "We are at your disposal," he said in carefully practiced English. Colonel Anderson had expected resistance, or at least hostility. Instead, he encountered a strange, almost serene acceptance. Later, in his official report, he wrote, "The Japanese capacity to pivot from total resistance to total compliance is remarkable and somewhat unsettling. The same spiritual discipline that enabled them to embrace suicide now enables them to embrace surrender with equal dedication." The American occupation forces were under strict orders to dismantle Japan's military infrastructure. Lieutenant Uemura watched as his Zero, still fitted with its 550-pound bomb, was pushed into the sea by an American bulldozer. "That aircraft was to be my funeral pyre," he told a Japanese-American interpreter. "Now I must find a reason to live instead." Lieutenant Colonel Anderson established his headquarters in the former Kamikaze Operations Building. There, he discovered Captain Miyazaki's logbooks with their meticulous calculations of victory through sacrifice. They genuinely believed they could win through sheer willpower, he commented to his executive officer. It never occurred to them that courage can't overcome physics. The atomic bombings had demonstrated this principle in the most dramatic possible way. A single B-29 crew could now deliver more destructive power than thousands of kamikaze pilots. The war had ultimately been decided not by the willingness to die, but by scientific advancement and industrial capacity. As part of the occupation process, American intelligence officers interviewed former kamikaze pilots to understand their psychology. Captain Stanley Greenfield conducted a series of sessions with Lieutenant Uemura and other survivors. Their worldview was fundamentally altered, he wrote in his analysis. Men who had achieved perfect acceptance of death now had to construct reasons to live. Many spoke of the bombings in almost religious terms, as a force of nature rather than a military action. Second Lieutenant Nakamura struggled more than most with this transition. During his interview with Captain Greenfield, he expressed lingering anger. You did not defeat us honorably in combat. You struck from beyond our reach with a power we could not counter. Greenfield's response was direct. War isn't about honor. It's about winning. You chose to sacrifice your pilots. We chose to save ours and invest in technology instead. This exchange captured the essential difference in approach. The kamikaze strategy represented the last gasp of a warrior tradition that prioritized personal courage and sacrifice. The atomic bomb represented the culmination of an industrial approach that valued systemic efficiency and technological advantage. Lieutenant Uemura's perspective evolved gradually. In October 1945, he was permitted to visit Hiroshima under military escort. The city's destruction exceeded anything he had imagined. Standing at the hypocenter, he looked up at the empty sky. "We were willing to die for the Emperor," he told his American escort. But no amount of willingness to die could have prevented this. The escort, Technical Sergeant David Miller, had been a B-29 gunner before the surrender. "That's what we tried to tell you guys," he replied. "Dying doesn't win wars. Building better weapons does." Captain Miyazaki, who accompanied them on this visit, surveyed the flattened landscape where a vibrant city had stood. "We miscalculated," he said simply. "Our entire strategy was based on the assumption that Americans would not accept casualties. We never considered that they would find a way to win without risking their men at all." By December 1945, most of the former kamikaze pilots had been processed through demobilization centers and returned to civilian life. Lieutenant Uemura, who had been studying engineering before the war, was admitted to the newly reopened Tokyo University under American sponsorship. The psychological transition remained difficult. Many former pilots experienced what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. Having mentally completed their lives, they struggled to begin anew. The suicide rate among kamikaze survivors was significantly higher than among other veteran groups. Others, like Lieutenant Uemura, found purpose in Japan's reconstruction. In his engineering studies, he focused on civil infrastructure, building rather than destroying, as he described it in a letter to Captain Greenfield in 1947. Second Lieutenant Nakamura took a different path. In 1946, he became a Buddhist monk at a temple in Kyoto. "I have exchanged one form of dedication for another," he explained to former squadron mates who visited him. "Before, I sought a meaningful death. Now, I seek a meaningful life." Captain Miyazaki's technical expertise led to his recruitment by American occupation authorities. He assisted in documenting Japanese aircraft designs and performance data, information that would later influence American aerospace engineering. His meticulous nature, once applied to calculating kamikaze effectiveness, now served the reconstruction effort. By 1948, the American occupation had shifted focus from demilitarization to rebuilding Japan as a democratic bulwark against communism in Asia. Former military personnel, initially excluded from public life, were gradually reintegrated into society. The Cold War had transformed former enemies into strategic allies. Lieutenant Uemura completed his engineering degree in 1949. His graduation thesis analyzed structural failures in Japanese military aircraft, an ironic topic given his former role. He identified how material shortages had forced compromises in aircraft production, creating planes that were increasingly unsafe even before their suicidal deployment. In 1951, Uemura accepted a position with a rebuilding Japanese industrial firm. The company, previously a manufacturer of military aircraft, now produced consumer goods for domestic use. The same factory that had built his Zero now made sewing machines and bicycles. The San Francisco Peace Treaty, signed on September 8, 1951, officially ended the Allied occupation of Japan. Lieutenant Uemura attended the local radio broadcast of the signing ceremony. As the news was announced, an elderly man near him wept openly. "We lost everything to learn what matters," the man said. Uemura nodded in agreement. "We believed spirit could overcome material reality," he replied. "The atomic bomb taught us otherwise." That same year, the United States tested a thermonuclear device with a yield of 10.4 megatons, 500 times more powerful than the Nagasaki bomb. The weapon that had seemed like an apocalyptic culmination in 1945 was already being superseded by even more destructive technology. Captain Miyazaki, now working for an emerging Japanese electronics company, commented on this development in a letter to Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, with whom he had maintained correspondence. The gap between our kamikaze technology and your atomic bomb was smaller than the gap between your atomic bomb and your hydrogen bomb. Progress accelerates exponentially when not constrained by tradition. The kamikaze pilots had represented the pinnacle of traditional Japanese warrior values: self-sacrifice, absolute loyalty, and spiritual strength. The atomic bomb had represented the pinnacle of American industrial and scientific capability. The collision between these two approaches had been decisive. By 1955, 10 years after the surrender, Japan had begun its remarkable economic recovery. Lieutenant Uemura, now an engineering manager, oversaw a department developing transistor radio technology. The discipline and dedication once directed toward death now powered economic rebirth. During a business trip to the United States in 1958, Uemura met with Captain Farabee, the bombardier who had released the Hiroshima bomb. The meeting, arranged through Captain Greenfield's continuing research into reconciliation, was initially tense. "I was prepared to dive my aircraft into your ship," Uemura said as they sat in a Washington, D.C. restaurant. "I was prepared to drop an atomic bomb on your city," Farabee replied evenly. After a moment of silence, both men began to laugh at the absurdity of their current situation, sharing a meal after having been committed to mutual destruction. "The war made us instruments rather than men," Farabee observed. "You as a human bullet, me as the delivery mechanism for an atomic bomb. Neither of us fully comprehended our role in the larger machinery of war." Uemura considered this perspective. "The difference," he finally said, "is that you returned home to your family, while I had said farewell to mine forever. Your country spent its treasure to bring you home safely. My country spent its young men like ammunition." This fundamental difference in values, personnel as expendable resources versus personnel as assets to be preserved, reflected deeper cultural and industrial realities. Japan, resource-poor and outmatched in production capacity, had attempted to compensate with human sacrifice. America, rich in resources and industrial capability, had invested in technology that magnified each soldier's impact while reducing risk. When asked years later about his kamikaze experience, Lieutenant Uemura would tell younger Japanese, "We were not wrong to be loyal or brave. We were wrong to believe that loyalty and bravery alone could overcome science and industry." The lesson of the atomic bomb is not that spirit doesn't matter, but that spirit must be channeled into creation rather than destruction. The kamikaze strategy had been born of desperation and cultural tradition. Approximately 3,800 Japanese pilots died in these attacks, sinking 47 Allied ships and damaging 300 others. By comparison, a single atomic bomb killed approximately 70,000 people instantly in Hiroshima, with tens of thousands more dying from injuries and radiation effects afterward. Lieutenant Uemura lived until 1997, becoming a grandfather and witnessing Japan's rise to economic superpower status. Near the end of his life, he was interviewed for a documentary about the kamikaze experience. The interviewer asked if he still believed in the values that had led him to volunteer for a suicide mission. "Courage, loyalty, self-sacrifice. These remain virtues," he replied thoughtfully. "But they must serve life, not death. The cherry blossoms fall every spring, yet the tree lives on to bloom again. That is the lesson I eventually learned." Captain Miyazaki, who passed away in 1985, had expressed a similar sentiment in his memoir. "We believed American materialism was their weakness and our spiritual strength was our advantage. We were wrong. Their material abundance was the product of a different kind of strength, scientific innovation, industrial efficiency, and pragmatic flexibility. Our spiritual discipline, divorced from material reality, led us to magnificent but futile gestures." Captain Miyazaki, interviewed for the study before his death, observed, "We consumed our seed corn. The very young men who should have led Japan's post-war reconstruction were instead dispatched to die. This represents perhaps our greatest strategic error, greater even than the decision to attack Pearl Harbor." By contrast, America's strategic bombing campaign, while killing many Japanese civilians, had preserved most of its college-educated youth for post-war leadership. Even the crew of the Enola Gay represented this approach, highly trained specialists whose expertise would later contribute to civilian sectors. In 1978, Lieutenant Uemura was invited to participate in an international conference on nuclear disarmament. His unique perspective as both a former kamikaze pilot and a survivor of Japan's defeat brought a powerful moral dimension to the technical discussions. Uemura nodded. "I was willing to die to kill perhaps 100 enemy sailors," he told them. The atomic bomb killed tens of thousands with the push of a button. This difference in scale represents a fundamental change in warfare. When killing becomes so effortless and massive, military honor becomes meaningless. His speech received a standing ovation from everyone. The man who had once embodied traditional warfare had become an eloquent voice against its modern counterpart. The historical irony was not lost on Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, now retired and serving as a Pentagon consultant. In a classified brief on Japanese industrial competition in 1980, he noted, "The same cultural traits that led Japan to embrace the kamikaze strategy, dedication, self-sacrifice, and group cohesion, have been redirected toward economic development with remarkable success. Their corporate warriors now conquer markets instead of territories." This assessment proved prescient. By the early 1980s, Japanese manufacturing had established global dominance in several high-technology sectors, particularly consumer electronics and automobiles. The nation that had once sent its best and brightest on suicide missions now deployed them in corporate boardrooms and research laboratories. Lieutenant Uemura played a role in this transformation. Before his retirement in 1983, he had become vice president of engineering at a leading technology firm. His company pioneered miniaturization techniques that helped define the portable electronics revolution. "We apply the same meticulous attention to detail that once went into our military equipment," he explained to American business reporters. "But now we create products that enhance life rather than end it." Second Lieutenant Nakamura emerged from his Buddhist monastery in 1985 to publish a philosophical treatise comparing kamikaze psychology to religious mysticism. The preparatory rituals, the focus on purification, the transcendence of fear, these elements parallel religious practices across many traditions, he wrote. The tragedy was not in the spiritual discipline itself, but in its application to destruction rather than enlightenment. This book sparked debate in Japan. Some criticized Nakamura for dignifying what they considered state-sponsored suicide. Others praised his insights and the path to reconciliation he offered former pilots. In 1991, as the Cold War ended, Captain Greenfield, the former intelligence officer who had interviewed kamikaze survivors, organized a reunion between American bomber crews and Japanese pilots at the Pearl Harbor Memorial. Lieutenant Uemura, now 69 years old, represented the kamikaze veterans. The meeting began as shared experiences of war transcended boundaries. Tibbets shook hands with Uemura in a moment captured by media. "We were both soldiers following orders," Tibbets said. "The responsibility lies with those who gave the orders, not those who carried them out." Uemura's response revealed how far his thinking had evolved. As soldiers, yes, we followed orders. But as human beings, we must each answer for our willingness to participate. I accepted death too readily. Perhaps you accepted the possibility of mass destruction too readily. We both have lessons to teach future generations. The story of the kamikaze pilots and the atomic bombings encapsulates the clash between two fundamentally different approaches to warfare, and indeed, to modernity itself. One looked backward to traditional values and the transcendent power of sacrifice. The other looked forward to technological solutions and the preservation of human capital. In the final years of his life, Lieutenant Uemura frequently spoke to Japanese business students about the lessons of the kamikaze experience. Dedication and sacrifice remain virtues, he would tell them. But they must be in service to creation, not destruction. Japan lost the war, but won the peace by redirecting its national spirit toward economic development. In 1995, Uemura returned to Hiroshima with his grandchildren. At the Peace Memorial, he explained how his journey had brought him from planned death to meaningful survival. "The cherry blossoms fall every spring," he told them, echoing a metaphor often used for the kamikaze pilots. Yet the tree lives on to bloom again. Your generation represents new blossoms on an ancient tree. Never forget the past, but do not be imprisoned by it either. In the end, the rising sun of Japanese imperial ambition was eclipsed by a different kind of rising sun, the artificial dawn of atomic weapons. The pilots who had offered their lives to prevent defeat instead lived to witness and ultimately participate in a different kind of victory, Japan's peaceful emergence as an economic and technological leader. As Lieutenant Uemura often told his grandchildren, "We were prepared to die for Japan." Learning to live for Japan proved much harder, but ultimately more powerful. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.